There was a time when everything seemed routine, predictable. But that's how things are before a bomb goes off, right? You don't see the cracks until you're ankle deep in the rubble. The irony is, it all started on the most mundane of days, an evening like any other. I had just come home from the gym, exhausted, drenched in sweat, feeling that post-workout burn that was supposed to keep me focused on something other than my own life. But no amount of heavy lifting could have prepared me for what I was about to find. She was in the kitchen, casually sipping wine, like it was just another Wednesday night. The smell of some overpriced candles filled the air, probably one of those lavender ones she loved so much. She was smiling, too much, like she was enjoying some private joke I wasn't a part of. There was something unsettling about that smile, something forced. But I didn't ask. Maybe I should have. Instead, I grabbed a beer, leaned against the counter, and asked her how her day went, the way I always did. Normal, predictable, the kind of question that usually ends with, "Good. How was yours?" But tonight, she barely even acknowledged me, distracted by her phone. I was about to let it go, just brush it off. But then I saw it, the name on her screen, James. And not just any James, mind you. This was her coworker James. The guy she mentioned a few times over the past few months, the one who was such a great guy to bounce ideas off of. I'll admit, I didn't think much of it at first. Just some work stuff, right? But something didn't sit right. I asked her casually, "What's going on with James? Seems like you two are chatting a lot these days." She flinched, for just a second, but I caught it. That split-second hesitation was all I needed to know something wasn't adding up. "Oh, it's just about work," she said, too quickly, waving me off like it was no big deal. Her eyes didn't meet mine though, which only made that sinking feeling in my gut twist harder. I wanted to believe her. God, I really did. But there was something off in her tone. Too rehearsed, too dismissive. So I played dumb. I nodded, shrugged, and pretended to be content with her answer. But all the while, my mind was spinning, connecting dots that hadn't even been on my radar before tonight. Later that evening, when she went to bed early, claiming exhaustion from work, I stayed up, pretending to watch some mindless TV show. But my focus was elsewhere. I grabbed her phone. Yes, I know how that sounds, but when your instincts scream at you, sometimes you've got to follow them, no matter how guilty it makes you feel. What I found, it wasn't just a work chat. It was a full-blown emotional affair, laced with, "I can't wait to see you again" messages. And guess what? Their little work meeting was scheduled for Friday. The same day she told me she'd be working late. I had no idea what to do with this discovery yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to wait around, playing the fool. She wanted to lie? Fine. But I was about to flip the whole damn script. And oh, did I have a plan for her and James? I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, those messages between her and James flashed in my mind like neon signs. "I miss you. Last night was incredible. Can't wait for Friday." I wasn't the kind of guy to sit around and cry into a pillow. I'm the type who plots, who calculates, and who makes sure things get dealt with properly. And if she thought she could play me for a fool, she had no idea what was coming. Friday. That was my deadline. 3 days to come up with a plan that would make this little betrayal blow up in her face. And trust me, I was going to be the one holding the match. First things first, I needed to confirm if this wasn't just emotional, if it had already crossed into something more. So I called in sick to work the next day. I didn't even tell her. Let her think it's a normal day. I waited until she left for work, and then I started digging. Deep. I wasn't some amateur. She never thought I'd look through our shared iCloud. Never considered the fact that all her photos, messages, everything was backed up. The thing about betrayal is that people get sloppy, cocky even. They think they're untouchable, like you're too stupid or blind to see the truth. She was no different. Within minutes, I found everything. Pictures, calls, locations, all the dirty little secrets she had been hiding. They had been meeting up for months. Months. And she had the audacity to sit at our dinner table every night, smiling, talking about her day, like nothing was happening. What got me wasn't even the texts, or the photos of them together in some random hotel room. It was her laughing about me. "He has no idea. I told him I'm working late again." Poor guy. Poor guy? That's what I was to her? Just some clueless idiot while she got cozy with another man? My blood was boiling. I wanted to scream, to storm into her office and tear the whole thing down. But no, that would be too easy, too quick. I wasn't going to make a scene, I was going to set the stage. I called up an old friend, Matt. He worked as a private investigator now, and we had always been close. He owed me a few favors, and this was the perfect time to cash them in. I asked him to tail her, follow her around for the next few days, document everything. She was a creature of habit, after all. If she thought she could lie her way through this affair, I wanted every detail down to the last breath she took. Matt didn't ask many questions, just agreed. I told him to follow her on Friday, especially. That's when things were supposed to get interesting. And while Matt was doing his thing, I had to make sure I set up my own little trap at home. You see, while she thought I'd be busy at work or out of the house, I planned to be exactly where I needed to be, waiting, watching. That night, she came home, kissed me on the cheek, told me she was exhausted from the day. I had to force myself not to flinch. The sheer audacity of it. She had no idea I'd already seen the photos of her and James, that I knew what exhaustion really meant. She had no clue I was already planning how to blow this whole charade sky high. And here's the kicker. Before heading to bed, she mentioned that she might have to work late on Friday again. Big meeting with the team, she said, eyes avoiding mine. Oh, don't worry about it, I replied, keeping my tone light. Take your time. I might have some things to do anyway. I don't think I've ever smiled so wide. In just a few days, she was going to get the surprise of her life. And this time, it wasn't going to be the kind she could laugh about with her new friend. Friday was coming fast, and she didn't know it yet, but she wasn't the only one who could play this game. Friday came faster than I expected, but not fast enough for the fire that was burning inside me. Every moment that week had been torture, having to look at her, having to pretend like I was some oblivious idiot who didn't see the knife she was twisting in my back. But Friday wasn't just any day. It was showtime. She played her part beautifully that morning. Woke up early, showered, came down looking immaculate, like she was ready for a big, important meeting. I even complimented her dress, the same one she wore on our last anniversary. What a joke. She thanked me with that fake smile she'd perfected, and I watched her pack her purse, checking her phone constantly, like she was waiting for some message. Her eyes flickered toward the clock. I might be home late tonight, she said casually, like she'd been rehearsing it all week. I nodded, pretending to be unfazed. Take your time. Once she left, I grabbed my phone. Matt had already texted me. She's on the move. I'll keep you posted. The minutes ticked by, but I wasn't idle. I had prepped the house for this moment. Cameras were already hidden in key places, the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom. Call me paranoid, but after everything I'd uncovered, I wasn't about to let any details slip. I wanted proof, not just for me, but for the moment this whole thing would blow up in her face. I was done being the fool. I got a text from Matt around noon. They've met up. Hotel, downtown. It's confirmed. I stared at the message for a while, knowing that while she was pretending to be working late, she was likely already wrapped around James somewhere, in some hotel bed. The rage simmered, but I forced it down. Not yet. I needed to stay calm, keep my head in the game. Matt sent me a few pictures. They strolled into the hotel lobby like they didn't have a care in the world, her hand casually resting on his arm. They looked like any normal couple, not two married people cheating on their spouses in broad daylight. I studied the images carefully, her smile, the way she leaned into him like I didn't even exist in her mind anymore. It was sickening, but I wasn't going to crash their little rendezvous. No, I had bigger plans. I waited, pacing the house, mentally rehearsing how the confrontation would go. There would be no yelling, no chaos, not from me anyway. I was going to let her hang herself with her own lies, and when she realized what I knew, it would be too late for her to backpedal. Hours passed, and around 6 p.m., I got another text from Matt. She's on her way home. The stage was set. I sat in the living room, casually flipping through a magazine, pretending like it was just another ordinary night. I heard the key turn in the lock, and she walked in, looking composed. There was no rush to hide anything, no panic in her eyes. Why would there be? She thought she had it all under control. Hey, she said, setting her purse down on the counter. Long day. I nodded. Yeah, mine too. But I managed to make dinner. I replied, motioning to the table where I'd set up a simple meal. She seemed surprised, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of guilt on her face. But then it was gone, replaced with that same casual, practiced smile. "Wow, you didn't have to do that," she said, walking over to give me a kiss on the cheek, the same lips that had probably been all over James just a few hours ago. The thought made my stomach churn. We sat down to eat and I let her talk. I let her tell me all about her meeting, about how exhausting her day had been. I nodded along, smiling at the right moments, making her believe she was still in control. But with every word she spoke, I could feel the tension building inside me, like a ticking time bomb. And then I dropped the first bombshell. "So, how's James?" I asked, cutting into my food. Her fork froze midway to her mouth, and for the first time that night, she looked caught off guard. "James? What do you mean?" she asked, too quickly. "Oh, I said, leaning back in my chair. "I figured he must have been at your meeting today, considering how much you two seem to talk." Her eyes narrowed, but she quickly covered it up, laughing nervously. "Oh, him? No, he wasn't there. Just the team. Liar." I could feel the anger rising, but I kept my voice steady. "Really? Because Matt, my friend, the private investigator, the one who's been following you, he says otherwise." Her face went pale. The blood drained from her cheeks as she stared at me, wide-eyed, like a deer caught in headlights. I could almost hear her brain scrambling to come up with a story, to dig herself out of the grave she didn't realize she'd been standing in all week. What are you talking about?" she stammered, dropping her fork onto the plate with a loud clink. I leaned forward, my voice calm, but sharp. "I know everything. The texts, the hotel, James, every last lie you've fed me." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in months, she had nothing to say. No witty comeback, no dismissive wave of the hand. She was trapped and she knew it, and this was just the beginning. For a moment, we sat in silence. The air between us was thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the explosion. She was still frozen, mouth slightly open, trying to process what I had just laid out. But I wasn't about to give her time to think, to come up with some half-baked excuse. "You're lying," she finally whispered, her voice shaky. Her eyes darted toward the door, like she was calculating an escape route. You're making this up. There's no private investigator. You're paranoid." I couldn't help but laugh. Not a loud, maniacal laugh, but that bitter, low kind, the one that comes from deep in your gut when the situation is so absurd that it's almost funny. "Paranoid," I echoed. "You think I'm making this up? You really think you're that slick?" I pulled my phone out of my pocket, scrolling through the pictures Matt had sent me earlier. I tossed the phone on the table, the screen facing her, and leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, watching as she stared at the images in horror. There it was, her and James, hand in hand, walking into the hotel. In another, they were seated at the hotel bar, close like no one else in the world mattered. I could practically see her mind working overtime, trying to formulate some kind of defense. But the proof was right there. I'd taken away her ability to talk her way out of this. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the phone, her eyes glued to the screen. She flipped through the photos, her face getting paler with each one. By the time she reached the last one, a close-up of her leaning in for a kiss outside the hotel, her composure completely shattered. I can explain," she stuttered, finally finding her voice, but it was weak, desperate. "It's not what it looks like. I swear. We didn't actually do anything. We were just talking. That's what she thought I'd believe." I felt a pulse of anger rush through me, but I held it down. I needed to stay in control. Let her twist herself into knots trying to cover her tracks. "Talking," I repeated, leaning forward, my voice cold. "That's the story you're going with? You didn't actually do anything?" She nodded, her eyes wide, looking more and more like a trapped animal. "It was just emotional. I never meant for it to go that far. I felt disconnected, okay? You were always busy, and I needed someone to talk to. Disconnected." I almost wanted to laugh again. That was her excuse? That she felt disconnected? "So you just decided to screw someone else to reconnect?" "I wasn't screwing anyone," she snapped, her voice rising. I didn't sleep with him. Her sudden burst of anger surprised me, but it didn't faze me. She was still trying to control the narrative, still clinging to the idea that if she didn't physically cheat, it didn't count. But I had already seen enough. I didn't need her confession to know the truth. You're lying, I said flatly, standing up from the table. Do you really think I'm that stupid? You've been sneaking around for months, and now you expect me to believe that it was all just talking. She got up too, her eyes welling up with fake tears. The act was almost impressive. Almost. Please listen to me. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't mean for it to get this far. It was a mistake. Okay? A terrible mistake. I stared at her, feeling this strange mix of fury and numbness. It was surreal, standing in front of the woman I thought I knew, watching her unravel in real time. She was scrambling, trying to gather up the pieces of her crumbling lie. But I was done giving her chances. Was it a mistake when you laughed about me in your texts? I asked, my voice cold, hard. When you called me the poor guy? Did you feel guilty then, too? Her face twisted in shock, like I had slapped her. She hadn't expected that. She didn't know I had read every single text. Yeah, I said, crossing my arms. I saw it all. Every little message. Every little, I can't wait to see you again. The way you joked about how clueless I was. About how easy it was to lie to me. Tears were streaming down her face now, but I wasn't moved. She had weaponized her tears before. I wasn't falling for it this time. Not after what I'd seen, what I'd uncovered. I didn't mean it, she choked out, stepping closer, reaching for my arm. I was just confused. It didn't mean anything. Please, you have to believe me. I pulled my arm away, shaking my head. Believe you? After all the lies? After everything I've seen? She dropped to the floor, sobbing into her hands, her whole body shaking. But there was no sympathy left in me. All I felt was the weight of her betrayal, the disgust. You were so damn sure you could keep this up, weren't you? I said, watching her crumble on the floor. So sure I'd never find out. That I'd just keep playing the fool while you snuck around with him. She didn't respond, just kept sobbing, her cries muffled by her hands. And in that moment, I felt it, a shift inside me. I realized I didn't care about her excuses, her tears, or even her so-called mistakes. There was no fixing this. No explanation that would make this right. I stood over her, my voice calm but firm. Get up. She looked up at me, confused, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. What? Get up. My voice was steady. We're not done yet. I was about to drop the biggest surprise yet. And this time, there was no way she could wriggle out of it. She slowly stood up, her face streaked with tears, eyes red and puffy, looking like a ghost of the woman she had been just an hour ago. But I wasn't swayed. Not by the tears, not by the pleading. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the one where I flipped the script entirely. I need you to sit, I said, my voice cold and controlled. She hesitated but eventually sat back down at the table, her hands trembling as she reached for a napkin to dab at her face. I've already spoken to James's wife, I said, watching her reaction closely. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with a mix of shock and horror. What? What do you mean? You? I cut her off. Yeah, you heard me. I've spoken to his wife. She knows everything too. The weight of my words hit her like a freight train. Her lips trembled as she tried to form a response, but no sound came out. I let that sink in for a moment, watching her try to grasp the gravity of the situation. You see, I continued, leaning in, this wasn't just about catching you in the act. No, I wanted everyone involved to know the truth. You and James? You thought you could live in this little fantasy, sneak around like your spouses didn't matter. But guess what? I called her 3 days ago. Her breath hitched in her throat. I could see the panic bubbling just under the surface now, like she was about to break all over again. What did you say to her? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I told her everything. I smiled. Sent her all the photos, all the texts, every little detail. No, 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 she muttered, shaking her head, her hands gripping the edges of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. You didn't. You can't. I did. And trust me, She wasn't too happy to find out her husband's been meeting up with you in hotel rooms. I imagine she's giving James the same treatment you're getting right now. I could see the gears turning in her head, the desperation growing as she tried to figure out how to salvage the situation. Her entire world was unraveling before her eyes. She wasn't just losing me. She was about to lose everything. "You've ruined me," she said, her voice breaking, as if I was the one to blame for this mess. "You've completely ruined my life." I almost laughed again, the sheer audacity of it. "I ruined your life? You've got some nerve saying that to me right now. You did this. You ruined your own life the moment you decided to betray me." She stood up suddenly, knocking her chair back, eyes wild with panic. I didn't mean for any of this. I didn't think it would go this far. James and I was confused, okay? I didn't feel like you cared anymore. I didn't feel like you loved me the way you used to." There it was again, her trying to twist the blame, trying to make this my fault. The frustration boiled over. "So that's your excuse? You didn't feel loved, so you went out and found it somewhere else? With someone else's husband?" "I was lonely," she screamed, her voice cracking as her emotions spilled out. "I needed something. You were always so distant, so caught up in everything else. I didn't know what to do anymore. And James, he listened. He made me feel wanted. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" The room went dead silent after that. Her words hung in the air, her voice shaking with emotion. But all I could feel was this cold, hard truth settling in my chest. There was nothing left to say that could justify this. No sob story, no emotional plea was going to fix this level of betrayal. I took a deep breath, letting the silence fill the room before I spoke again. "Do you even hear yourself right now?" My voice was calm, deadly quiet. "You think I'm just going to sit here and buy this crap about how you felt unloved? We've all had rough patches. Every couple does. But what you did, you chose to destroy everything we built for what? A few hotel rooms? Some texts with another man." Her lip quivered, but she stayed quiet, knowing there was nothing she could say to justify it. "I've had plenty of moments where I felt distant, where I questioned things. But you know what I didn't do? I didn't run into the arms of someone else. I leaned in, my eyes locking onto hers. You had a choice. You could have talked to me. We could have worked through whatever the hell you were feeling. But instead, you ran straight to James. Don't stand there and tell me I ruined your life. You did this, and now you're going to face the consequences." She stood there, silent and small, her tears still flowing, but her excuses drying up. She knew there was no way out now, no lie big enough to cover this up. I pulled my phone out one more time, tapping the screen before placing it face up on the table. "You might want to listen to this." I pressed play on the audio. It was a recording, her voice, and James's, from their last meeting in the hotel. The audio crackled as their voices filled the room. Her soft laugh, his murmurs, the way they spoke to each other like they were the only two people in the world. They had no idea they were being recorded. Her face went ashen. How did you? Remember that little Bluetooth speaker you keep in your purse?" I asked, my voice calm but ice cold. "I borrowed it for a bit. You know, the one you never bothered to check before leaving for your meetings." She looked like she was going to be sick. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out what to say, how to salvage this. But there was no salvaging left. I had her cornered. "You can keep denying it all you want. But this," I gestured to the phone, where her voice still played, "this is all the proof I need. It's over." Her hands trembled as she stared at me, utterly defeated. There were no more tears now, no more excuses, just silence. "I'm filing for divorce," I said quietly but firmly. "And I suggest you pack your things. You can spend the night somewhere else." She didn't argue, didn't fight. She just stood there, staring at the floor, her once perfect world crumbling around her feet. And in that moment, I felt a strange sense of relief. This chapter was done. She stood there, motionless, the weight of my words hitting her like a brick wall. Her shoulders slumped, her face drained of color. For the first time in all of this, she looked truly defeated. No more fake tears, no more desperate excuses. Just nothing. "Pack your things," I repeated, my voice steady but sharp. You can go to James's place for all I care." At the mention of his name, her face twisted with something between regret and fear. I could tell she was starting to understand just how deep the consequences ran. It wasn't just us. It was them, her and James, their little affair, and the mess they'd made of both of our lives. "I'll go," she whispered, her voice hollow. She didn't even look at me, just turned and shuffled toward the stairs, her movements slow and robotic, like her body was going through the motions while her mind had already checked out. I watched her disappear upstairs, feeling strangely calm now that everything was laid out in the open. No more lies, no more wondering if I was imagining things. It was all out there, raw and real. The betrayal had hit, and now the cleanup had begun. While she packed, I sat back down at the kitchen table, staring at the remnants of the dinner I had made. It felt like a scene from another life. Just an hour ago, I had been playing the part of the clueless husband, letting her spin her web of lies, waiting for the moment to snap it all shut. Now it was like the air had been sucked out of the house, and all that was left was this eerie quiet. I couldn't even bring myself to feel sad anymore. The anger, the disgust, they had burned through me like wildfire earlier, but now there was only this cold, hollow space where those emotions had been. A part of me had already moved on, checked out, detached from the wreckage she had caused. She came downstairs about 15 minutes later, a small suitcase in hand, her face drawn and pale. She didn't look at me. I could tell she wanted to say something. Some final plea, some last-ditch effort to save whatever sliver of dignity she had left. But she didn't. Maybe she finally understood there was nothing left to save. I'll stay with a friend tonight," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not even bothering to ask who this friend was. It didn't matter. She could go wherever she wanted, but she wasn't staying here. Not anymore. She paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and for a brief second, I thought she might turn around, say something, try to apologize one last time. But she didn't. She just stood there, frozen, as if she couldn't quite bring herself to leave. And then, without another word, she opened the door and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for a while, staring at the door, waiting for the weight of everything that had just happened to crash down on me. But it didn't. There was no breakdown, no moment of overwhelming emotion. Just quiet. It felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. The woman I had spent years building a life with was gone, and instead of feeling shattered, I just felt done. I didn't move for what felt like hours. I just sat there, the events of the night playing over and over in my mind. The confrontation, the lies, the panic in her eyes when I revealed everything I knew. I had been waiting for some kind of catharsis, some big emotional release, but it never came. Instead, I found myself thinking about James, about his wife, about the wreckage that lay ahead for all of us. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for tonight the storm had passed. It was close to midnight when my phone buzzed. I glanced down at the screen, expecting it to be Matt, maybe with some final update. But no, it was from James's wife. We'd been in contact since I told her everything, and she'd been handling it in her own way. Quietly, methodically, much like me. The message was short. He's gone too, leaving with nothing but his guilt. I stared at the words, imagining James doing the same walk of shame out of his own house. I didn't feel any pity for him. If anything, I felt satisfied. There was something poetic about it. He and my wife had thought they could have their little secret world. But now their lives were unraveling just like ours had. But even as I read the message, I couldn't help but wonder, what would come next? The affair was exposed, the confrontations were done, but there was still this nagging sense of unfinished business. It wasn't just about her leaving. It was about what came after. Divorce was inevitable, sure, but beyond that, what did it mean to pick up the pieces? How do you even begin to rebuild when your life has been torched to the ground? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the conversations, all the memories, all the promises that had been shattered in the span of a few days. And then I thought about James, wondering if he was out there somewhere, staring at his own broken pieces, wondering what the hell had gone wrong. One thing was for sure, neither of them had seen this coming. My wife had always been so sure of herself, so confident in her ability to keep her secret life under wraps. She probably thought she'd never get caught, that she could keep this charade going for as long as she wanted. But secrets have a funny way of finding the light, and once they're out, there's no putting them back in the dark. I finally stood up, stretched, and walked to the window. The street outside was quiet, empty, like the world had moved on without me. And maybe it had. Maybe that was the next step, moving on. The house was quiet, eerily so. No sounds of her moving around. No rustling in the kitchen. No faint hum of her favorite podcast playing while she pretended to work. Just silence. It was as if her absence had sucked the life out of the place, leaving behind a hollow shell. But instead of feeling sad or lonely, I felt something strange. Relief. Like I could finally breathe again after holding it in for far too long. That night, I didn't sleep much. My mind kept replaying the confrontation, her pathetic excuses, the look on her face when I told her James's wife knew. I imagined James going through the same fallout I had just put her through, watching his own life crumble under the weight of his lies. For a brief second, I wondered if he regretted it, if either of them did. But then I realized it didn't matter. Regret wouldn't fix anything. Not for me and definitely not for them. By the next morning, I had made my decision. It wasn't just about the divorce anymore. It was about reclaiming control over my life, over the mess she had made of everything. I wasn't going to let her betrayal define me. Wasn't going to let this whole situation drag me down into the same pit of lies and misery she'd been living in. If anything, this was my chance to rebuild. And I was going to make damn sure I did it right. I called my lawyer first thing. We'd spoken briefly before, just to get the ball rolling. But now I wanted to push things forward. Fast. I didn't want to drag this out. Didn't want to give her the opportunity to play any more games. The conversation was short and efficient. He told me we had enough evidence to make the divorce as clean and quick as possible. There wasn't much left for her to fight over, not after the mess she'd created. Next on my list was James's wife. I knew I owed her more than a phone call. We'd both been blindsided by this, and while we had our own ways of dealing with the wreckage, we were still in this together, at least for now. I didn't want anything from her, but I felt like we needed to close the loop. I called her that afternoon, keeping it casual but direct. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm, almost too calm, like she'd already moved past the initial shock and was now just dealing with the cleanup. "How are you holding up?" I asked, not knowing how else to start. There was a pause on the other end. "I'm fine, I guess," she replied. "As fine as you can be after finding out your husband's been screwing around behind your back for months." I could hear the bitterness in her voice, but it was laced with something else, too. Resignation. Like she had already accepted what had happened, already figured out how to move on. And maybe she had. She seemed tougher than I was in some ways. "I know it's a lot," I said quietly. "I just wanted to check in, make sure you were doing okay." Considering we were both married to liars?" she said with a dry laugh. "Yeah, I guess we're doing great." There was a pause, and then her voice softened. "Thanks for telling me. I'm sure it wasn't easy." "No," I admitted. "But I figured you deserved to know. Better from me than finding out on your own later." She sighed. "Yeah, I guess so. I've already kicked him out. He's staying with some friend, or so he says. But honestly, I don't care where he is as long as it's not here." I couldn't help but nod, even though she couldn't see me. "I get it." I told her to leave too. There was a brief silence, like we were both reflecting on the surreal reality we now found ourselves in. Two strangers connected by the betrayal of our spouses. It was almost ridiculous when I thought about it. "Do you ever wonder how long they thought they could keep it up?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Like, how long did they think we wouldn't notice? That we were just stupid? I smiled bitterly. "Oh, I'm sure they thought they could string us along for as long as they wanted. That we'd never find out." "Well, they were wrong," she said firmly, and for the first time, I heard a note of strength in her voice. They were both wrong. We didn't talk much longer after that. There wasn't much left to say. But before we hung up, she asked me something I hadn't expected. "So, what are you going to do now? After all this?" It was a simple question, but I realized I hadn't actually thought about it. Not really. I'd been so focused on catching them, on confronting her, that I hadn't considered what came next for me. Now that the betrayal was exposed and the path forward was clear, what was I supposed to do with myself? I don't know, I admitted, leaning back in my chair. Maybe start fresh. Focus on me for a change. She laughed softly. Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. I think I'll do the same. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, staring out the window. The world outside felt strange, like it was moving forward while I was still standing in the same spot, trying to catch my breath. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't keep reliving the betrayal, replaying the lies in my head. I had to move on. For myself. That evening, I started clearing out the house. Her stuff was still here. Clothes, shoes, little things she'd left behind in her rush to leave. I piled them all into bags and boxes, not even caring where they ended up. I just needed them gone. Needed the space to feel like mine again. Each item I tossed into the bag felt like another step toward freedom. Another piece of her that I was finally shedding. By the time I was done, the house felt emptier, but lighter too. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking around at the space that had once been ours and was now just mine. It was strange, but it felt right. The divorce papers would be filed soon, and then legally it would all be over. But I knew the emotional part, the healing, was going to take time. And that was okay. I wasn't in a rush. For the first time in a long time, I was going to take things at my own pace. I had no idea what my life would look like in a few months, or even a year from now. But one thing was clear. I wasn't that poor guy anymore. The one she laughed about in her texts. The one who was too blind to see what was happening right under his nose. I had taken control back. And now I was going to rebuild. On my terms. As I stood there, alone but not broken, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Days turned into weeks, and the numbness that had settled in after that night slowly began to lift. The house was quieter now. Too quiet at first, but it became less suffocating as I made the space mine again. I spent those first few days in a sort of haze, doing mundane things that felt like nothing but filled the hours. Laundry, dishes, clearing out her old stuff. It was like wiping the slate clean piece by piece. Felt right, therapeutic almost. But even as I tried to move forward, the shadows of what had happened still lingered. The image of her, of them, haunted me more than I wanted to admit. Not in the way that made me want her back. God, no, but in a way that made me question everything. How could someone I had trusted for so long turn into a stranger right in front of my eyes? How could I have missed all the signs? Those thoughts followed me everywhere, creeping up in quiet moments, whispering in my ear when I was alone. The betrayal had cut deeper than I'd realized, and no amount of cleaning or boxing up her things could wipe away the scars left behind. But I was determined. I wasn't going to let her win, wasn't going to let what she did define who I was going to become. So I made a choice. I started doing things for me. Small at first, going out for runs, hitting the gym more regularly, cooking for myself instead of just eating takeout every night. The more I invested in myself, the more I started feeling like I was coming back to life. It was strange, this newfound freedom. There was no one to check in with, no one to navigate around. Just me and my thoughts, which were getting clearer by the day. I started thinking about all the things I'd put on hold over the years, dreams, hobbies, plans that I had sacrificed for the sake of us. And now, for the first time in a long time, there was no us. Just me. And honestly, felt pretty damn good. A few weeks after she left, I finally had a moment to breathe. I'd filed the divorce papers, and the process was already in motion. No fights, no drawn-out drama. She didn't even contest it. I think she knew it was pointless. We were over, and she didn't have any ground to stand on. James was dealing with his own fallout, and from what I'd heard through mutual contacts, his life was in shambles. Karma's a hell of a thing. I was sitting on the back porch one evening, watching the sun set, the warm light painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was one of those quiet moments where the world feels still, like it's holding its breath. I had a beer in hand, just soaking it all in. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about her. I wasn't replaying the betrayal in my head. I was just there. In the moment, my phone buzzed, breaking the silence. I glanced at the screen. It was Matt, the PI who had helped me get through the darkest part of this whole mess. We hadn't spoken much since I'd confronted her, but he'd been checking in here and there, This time, though, the message was short, almost cryptic. You won't believe what I found out today. Call me when you can. I raised an eyebrow. What else could there possibly be? I thought the whole saga was over. The affair was exposed, the marriage was dead, the divorce was underway. What more could there be to discover? Curiosity got the best of me, so I dialed his number, half expecting him to tell me something minor, maybe some final detail about James or my soon-to-be ex. Hey! Matt answered on the second ring. Glad you called back. Yeah, you got me curious, I said, leaning back in my chair. What's up? There was a pause on the other end, like he was trying to find the right words. So I did some digging, more than you asked for, honestly. After you filed for divorce, I figured everything was pretty much wrapped up, but something didn't sit right with me. My heart started to race a little. What do you mean? I followed James for a bit after everything went down, just to make sure there wasn't more going on behind the scenes. And I found out something interesting. Your wife wasn't the first. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? James had more affairs. Not just him, her too. Turns out she's been unfaithful for a lot longer than you thought. James was just the latest in a string of affairs. I've got proof. Emails, texts going back years. My stomach dropped. I thought I'd hit the bottom of this betrayal, but here it was. Another layer. Another secret she'd kept hidden. Years? How many lies had she told? And for how long? Why didn't you tell me this earlier? I asked, trying to process what he was saying. I didn't have solid proof until now. I didn't want to bring it to you without being 100% sure. But now, I've got everything. I sat there in silence, letting the news sink in. It was like being punched in the gut all over again, but this time, it felt distant, numb, almost like I had expected something like this, deep down. Send me what you have, I said finally. I want to see it. Matt agreed, and within minutes, my phone pinged with emails and screenshots. I didn't open them right away. I just stared at the phone in my hand, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. Anger at how deep the betrayal had gone, but relief that I was truly done with her now. There was no part of me left that wanted answers from her. I didn't need explanations anymore. I was free. That night, I deleted all the messages, all the files Matt had sent. I didn't need them to hold onto this part of my life anymore. I had my answers, but more than that, I had my closure. And I was ready to move forward. As I sat there, watching the last bit of sunlight disappear over the horizon, I felt something new stirring inside me. It wasn't just hope, it was excitement, a sense of anticipation for whatever was coming next. I had survived the storm, come out the other side, and now it was time to rebuild, time to live for myself. The chapter was finally closed, and for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see what came next.